The limousine pulling through Marcus Whitmore's gates wasn't supposed to exist. His ex-wife Isabella was supposed to arrive broken, humiliated, ready to watch him marry a supermodel. Instead, she stepped out like royalty, diamonds glittering, mysterious prince by her side, moving with the confidence of someone who owned the world. Marcus's hands shook as he watched the security footage, because 3 years ago he'd left her with nothing. Destroyed her completely. Made sure she'd never recover. So how the hell did she just arrive in a car worth more than his mansion, looking like she could buy and sell him 10 times over? The answer will shatter everything you think you know about revenge. What do you think happened to Isabella in those 3 years? Drop a comment below. I have a feeling your guesses won't even come close to the truth. We're about to uncover. The woman who emerged from the limousine moved like liquid starlight, each step deliberate and hypnotic as her designer heels clicked against the imported Italian marble of Marcus's driveway. Isabella Moreau. No, she'd taken back her maiden name, Marcus realized with a jolt, was unrecognizable from the broken creature he discarded 3 years ago. Her once shoulder-length auburn hair now cascaded in luxurious waves down to her waist, catching the California sun like burnished copper, and her olive skin glowed with the kind of radiance that only came from inner peace and expensive skincare. She wore a midnight blue silk dress that hugged every curve of her now toned 5 feet 6 inches frame, the fabric shimmering with each movement as if sewn from the night sky itself. Diamonds, real ones, Marcus's trained I could tell, glittered at her throat and wrists, but it was her face that stopped his breath entirely. Gone were the stress lines, the hollow cheeks, the haunted look that had plagued her final months in their marriage. At 34, Isabella looked younger than she had at 30, her emerald eyes bright with secrets and her full lips curved in a smile that held mysteries Marcus couldn't begin to fathom. But it was what followed her out of the limousine that made his knees nearly buckle. A man in an impeccable charcoal suit, tall and broad-shouldered with salt and pepper hair and the kind of confident bearing that screamed old money, extended his hand to help her, his touch lingering on her fingers with obvious intimacy, and when Isabella laughed at something he whispered, the sound was like silver bells. Nothing like the nervous giggle Marcus remembered, and suddenly the wedding planner was beside him again, her voice tight with barely controlled panic as she whispered, "Mr. Whitmore, that limousine, it has diplomatic plates, and there are 2 security vehicles behind it, and I think, oh my God, is that Isabella Moreau, the Isabella Moreau?" The name hit Marcus like a physical blow because he'd heard it whispered in the highest circles for months now, the mysterious woman who'd appeared seemingly overnight in European high society, the one whose art exhibitions in Paris and Milan had sold out in minutes, whose charity galas raised millions with a single event, whose very presence at a function guaranteed its success, but surely it couldn't be his Isabella, his broken, worthless ex-wife who couldn't even hold down a job at a small town gallery. Except the security footage didn't lie, and neither did the way every guest at his wedding was now turning to stare as she glided through his gardens like she owned them, her mysterious companion's hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The chaos that erupted in Marcus's chest was nothing compared to what happened next, because as Isabella approached the assembled crowd of his carefully curated guest list, billionaires, senators, Hollywood royalty, tech moguls, all the people he'd spent decades clawing his way toward, something impossible began to unfold before his disbelieving eyes. Isabella. Darling. Senator Patricia Blackwood, the Iron Lady of California politics and someone who'd never given Marcus more than a polite nod despite his substantial campaign donations, swept toward his ex-wife with genuine warmth, air-kissing her cheeks like they were old friends. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear. How was the flight from Monaco?" Monaco? Marcus's mind reeled as tech billionaire David Chun, a man whose friendship Marcus had been courting for 5 years without success, actually abandoned his conversation with other titans of Silicon Valley to embrace Isabella warmly, saying something in rapid Mandarin that made her throw back her head and laugh with genuine delight. "Isabella speaks 7 languages now," someone murmured behind Marcus, and he spun to see his own wedding guests, people he'd handpicked to witness his triumph, whispering among themselves with a kind of excitement usually reserved for A-list celebrity sightings. Did you hear about her foundation? She's donated over $50 million to autism research this year alone. $50 million? Marcus's throat constricted as the number echoed in his skull, because 3 years ago Isabella hadn't been able to afford groceries, let alone make charitable donations that dwarfed his own company's annual profits. And that man with her, isn't that Prince Alessandro di Luca? The Italian heir who owns half of Tuscany. The pieces weren't fitting together, couldn't fit together, because the woman he was watching command the attention of every powerful person at his own wedding was supposed to be destroyed, supposed to be nothing, supposed to be proof that Marcus Whitmore always won and always got everything he wanted. But instead she was gliding through his guests like a queen among subjects, her mysterious companion, a prince apparently, because of course he was, murmuring something in her ear that made her face light up with joy, the kind of pure happiness Marcus suddenly realized he'd never seen on her face during their entire 5-year marriage, not even on their wedding day when she looked beautiful but haunted, glowing but somehow fragile, and now here she was, transformed into someone who looked like she'd never known a moment of doubt or pain in her entire life. And when their eyes finally met across the sea of his wedding guests, her smile didn't waver, didn't fade, didn't show even a flicker of the heartbreak and rage he'd expected. Instead she raised her champagne glass in a small toast. Where had she gotten champagne? And mouthed 2 words that made his blood freeze in his veins. Thank you. What could Isabella possibly be thanking Marcus for? And how did a broken woman transform into European royalty's companion in just 3 years? Share your wildest theories in the comments below. Trust me, the truth is more shocking than anything you could imagine. The wedding ceremony began like a fever dream, with Marcus standing at the altar in his $15,000 Tom Ford tuxedo, his hands trembling imperceptibly as he watched Isabella take a seat in the 3rd row, not in the back where he'd expected her to hide in shame, but prominently positioned where everyone could see her, Prince Alessandro's arm draped casually across the back of her chair like he owned her, like she was his most precious possession. The priest, Father Mackenzie, a man Marcus had specifically chosen for his theatrical flair and booming voice, began the ceremony with the traditional words about love and commitment, but Marcus could barely focus because Isabella's presence was like a magnetic force pulling every eye in the garden toward her, and he watched in growing horror as his own guests, people who barely acknowledged him despite his wealth, kept stealing glances at his ex-wife and her mysterious companion, their whispered conversations growing louder with each passing minute. Is that really her? I heard she's worth more than him now. The prince bought her a chateau last month. She's funding 3 hospitals in Africa. The murmurs created a buzz that threatened to overshadow his own vows, and when Cassandra finally appeared at the head of the aisle in her couture gown, looking every inch the perfect trophy wife he'd ordered like a luxury car, Marcus felt a sick satisfaction that his plan was finally back on track, until he noticed that Isabella wasn't even watching the bride's grand entrance. Instead she was examining her diamond-encrusted watch with the bored expression of someone checking the time at a doctor's appointment, and when Prince Alessandro leaned over to whisper something in her ear, she actually stifled a yawn behind her perfectly manicured hand, as if this entire spectacle was beneath her notice. The rage that exploded in Marcus's chest was white-hot and consuming, because Isabella was supposed to be devastated, supposed to be weeping with jealousy and regret, supposed to be realizing exactly what she'd lost when she betrayed him with that pathetic art teacher, but instead she looked like a woman who'd stumbled into someone else's boring home movie and was politely waiting for it to end so she could return to her real life, her infinitely more interesting life that somehow included European princes and diplomatic immunity and enough wealth to make his own fortune look like pocket change. Cassandra's vows were picture-perfect, delivered with the practiced precision of someone who'd rehearsed them 100 times, her voice carrying across the garden as she promised to love, honor, and cherish Marcus until death do them part. Words that should have filled him with triumph, but instead felt hollow because he could see his guests checking their phones, could see their attention drifting toward Isabella, who was now having what appeared to be an animated conversation in Italian with the prince, her eyes sparkling with intelligence and humor that Marcus had somehow never noticed during their marriage. And when it came time for his own vows, the words he'd crafted specifically to wound Isabella, about finding true love after surviving betrayal, about building a future with someone worthy of his devotion, died in his throat because she wasn't even listening, was instead studying the intricate architecture of his mansion with a detached interest of someone appraising real estate. And it was in that moment of stuttering silence that everything went sideways, because Isabella's phone buzzed and she glanced at it with a slight frown, then leaned over to whisper something urgent to Prince Alessandro, who immediately stood and offered her his arm, and as the entire wedding party watched in stunned silence, Isabella rose gracefully from her seat and began walking toward the altar, not in the stumbling, desperate way Marcus had fantasized about during his cruelest moments, but with the fluid confidence of a woman who belonged in palaces and boardrooms, her heels clicking like a countdown to Judgment Day. "Excuse me," her voice cut through the wedding ceremony like silk over steel, cultured now with just a hint of a European accent that hadn't been there 3 years ago. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I've just received some rather urgent news that I think Marcus should hear immediately." The priest stopped mid-sentence. Cassandra's bouquet dropped from nerveless fingers, and 300 of the world's most powerful people held their collective breath as Isabella reached into her small designer clutch. Hermes, Marcus noted with the automatic recognition of someone who'd bought Cassandra 3 of them, and withdrew a thick legal envelope sealed with red wax, the kind used for documents of international importance. "You see," Isabella continued, her voice carrying easily across the silent garden, "I've just been informed that the forensic accountants I hired have completed their investigation into certain irregularities in Whitmore Industries' offshore accounts, and well," she smiled, the expression beautiful and terrible and absolutely devastating, "it seems there are some rather interesting discrepancies that the SEC, the FBI, and several international banking authorities are quite eager to discuss with you." The envelope landed on the altar steps with a soft thud that sounded like thunder, and Marcus felt his world begin to tilt off its axis because this was impossible. This was revenge beyond anything he could have imagined. This was Isabella, his broken, worthless ex-wife, holding a weapon that could destroy not just his wedding day, but his entire empire, and as he stared at her transformed face, he realized with creeping horror that everything he thought he knew about their divorce, about her betrayal, about the reasons their marriage had ended, might have been as carefully constructed as the lies he'd told himself to justify what he'd done to her. The legal envelope sits on the altar like a bomb waiting to explode. What secrets could Isabella have uncovered about Marcus's business empire? And how did a broken woman with nothing transform into someone who clearly has the resources to hire international forensic accountants? Drop your theories below, because this is only the beginning of Isabella's revenge. The silence that followed Isabella's bombshell stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, 300 of the world's most influential people frozen in their white chairs as Marcus Whitmore, billionaire, shark destroyer of companies and lives, bent slowly to pick up the envelope with hands that shook like autumn leaves, his face draining of color until his usual golden tan looked more like old parchment. "Open it." Isabella's voice was silk wrapped around steel, her emerald eyes never leaving his face as she stepped closer to the altar, Prince Alessandro moving with her like a shadow, his own expression unreadable but his protective stance speaking volumes about whatever relationship had blossomed between them in Isabella's mysterious new life. Marcus's fingers fumbled with the red wax seal, real wax, he noticed, the kind that required old-world craftsmanship and cost more than most people's monthly salaries. And as the document spilled out, page after page of financial records, bank statements, and what looked like surveillance photos, his knees nearly buckled because these weren't just random accusations. This was a surgical dissection of crimes he'd thought were buried so deep that God himself couldn't find them. The first page alone made his vision blur. Detailed records of the 12 shell companies he'd used to funnel money from his government contracts, the bribes he'd paid to secure the military deals that had made him his first 100 million, the environmental disasters his factories had caused in developing countries, complete with photographs of poisoned rivers and displaced families. And at the bottom of each page was a signature he recognized with growing dread, his own, along with timestamps. And locations that proved these weren't forgeries but actual evidence, somehow obtained from sources that should have been impossible to access. How? The word escaped his lips like a prayer, and Isabella's smile widened, transforming her face into something both angelic and terrifying, the expression of a woman who'd spent 3 years planning this moment with the patience of a spider weaving the perfect web. "Oh, darling," she purred, her accent now clearly refined, European, the kind that came from years among people who considered American nouveau riche to be quaint curiosities. "Did you really think that destroying my life wouldn't have consequences? Did you honestly believe that a woman who graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School would just disappear into poverty without understanding exactly why her husband had suddenly turned into a monster?" The second half of the envelope's contents hit Marcus like a tsunami of pure terror, because mixed in with the financial crimes were photographs he'd never seen before. Images of him entering a nondescript office building in Delaware, him shaking hands with men whose faces he'd hoped never to see again. Him signing documents that had resulted in 3 journalists' deaths in South America when they'd gotten too close to exposing his mining operations' human rights violations. And as he flipped through page after page of evidence, each more damning than the last, he began to understand that Isabella hadn't just stumbled into wealth and European royalty by accident. She'd been playing a game so sophisticated, so long-term, and so perfectly executed that it made his own manipulations look like a child's tantrum. "You see," Isabella continued conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather instead of systematically destroying his life in front of everyone he'd ever wanted to impress, "when you threw me out with nothing, I did what any intelligent woman would do. I got curious about why my loving husband had suddenly become a sociopathic stranger overnight, and it's amazing what you can discover when you're invisible. When you're so broken that people don't bother to watch what you're doing or where you're going." She gestured elegantly toward Prince Alessandro, who stepped forward with the fluid grace of someone born to power, his dark eyes holding secrets of their own. "May I introduce my fiancé, Prince Alessandro di Luca, heir to the di Luca banking dynasty and, more relevantly, director of the International Financial Crimes Investigation Unit, a position that comes with certain privileges when it comes to accessing supposedly secure financial records." The prince's smile was razor-sharp as he addressed the crowd, his accented English carrying the authority of someone accustomed to toppling governments before breakfast. "I must apologize for the dramatic timing, but when my beloved Isabella shared her concerns about Mr. Whitmore's business practices, we felt it was our civic duty to ensure that justice was served, and I'm afraid the evidence we've compiled over the past 2 years has been quite illuminating." The gasps from the crowd were audible now, phones appearing in hands as the guests realized they were witnessing not just a wedding disruption but potentially the exposure of one of the decade's largest financial scandals. And Marcus watched in horrified fascination as his perfectly planned day transformed into his own public execution, orchestrated by the woman he'd thought he'd buried alive. But Isabella wasn't finished, not even close, because she reached into her clutch again and withdrew a second envelope, this one bearing the seal of the Swiss Banking Commission, and Marcus felt his bladder nearly release because he knew, with the certainty of a man watching his own death warrant being signed, that this envelope contained information about accounts he'd thought were untouchable, money he'd hidden so carefully that even his own lawyers didn't know about it. The lovely thing about being engaged to someone with diplomatic immunity, Isabella said conversationally, her voice carrying clearly across the garden where his guests sat transfixed like spectators at a gladiator match, is that certain international banking privacy laws become rather flexible, especially when human rights violations are involved. She held up photographs that made Marcus's vision gray around the edges, aerial shots of the mass graves outside his Congo operations, documented evidence of the child labor in his cobalt mines, financial records showing how he'd paid warlords to clear villages so his extraction teams could work unimpeded. And suddenly the fairy tale wedding he'd planned as the crown jewel of his revenge against Isabella had become his own war crimes tribunal, with his ex-wife serving as judge, jury, and executioner in a designer dress that probably cost more than the average person's house. The irony was so perfect, so exquisitely crafted, that Marcus almost admired it. Almost, because admiration was difficult when you were watching your entire life's work crumble in real time, when the woman you'd systematically tortured was revealing that not only had she survived your worst, she'd thrived beyond your wildest nightmares and positioned herself to deliver a retribution so complete that it would echo through financial markets worldwide. The flashback hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the skull as Isabella's voice continued to slice through the garden air, because suddenly he was remembering that night 3 years ago when everything had changed, when he'd come home early from his business trip to Singapore, a trip that had actually been a cover for meeting with arms dealers in Cambodia about supplying weapons to rebels who would clear mining territories for him, and found Isabella in his study, not cheating with her art teacher as he'd told everyone, but sitting at his desk with tears streaming down her face, surrounded by printouts of bank statements and photographs that looked remarkably similar to what she was now displaying to his wedding guests. "You found them," he'd said that night, his voice deadly calm as he'd stood in the doorway watching his wife of 5 years realize that the man she'd married was a monster, and Isabella had looked up at him with those emerald eyes wide with horror and disbelief, her voice breaking as she'd whispered, "Marcus, these children, these families, how could you?" But instead of confessing, instead of explaining, instead of showing even a shred of the remorse that might have saved their marriage, Marcus had chosen the path that had defined his entire life: attack, destroy, win at any cost. And he'd spent the next 6 months systematically destroying Isabella's world, convincing her that she was losing her mind, that the documents she'd found were forgeries planted by business rivals, that her paranoid delusions were signs of a mental breakdown that required treatment. And when she'd finally cracked under the pressure of his gaslighting campaign and suffered what their doctor had called a stress-induced psychotic episode, Marcus had used her hospitalization as grounds for divorce, painting himself as the long-suffering husband of an unstable woman while quietly moving his most damning assets offshore and ensuring that Isabella's recovery would be slow, painful, and poverty-stricken. The memory of her face during their final court appearance still haunted his dreams sometimes. Hollow-cheeked, medicated, wearing a cheap dress from Walmart because he'd frozen all her accounts, standing alone while his team of lawyers painted her as delusional, dangerous, unworthy of even basic spousal support, and he'd felt a twisted satisfaction as the judge had awarded him everything, leaving Isabella with nothing but the clothes on her back and a restraining order that prevented her from coming within 1,000 yards of him or his properties. That had been his masterpiece, his greatest victory, the moment when Marcus Whitmore had proven that he could destroy even the people who loved him most if they dared to threaten his empire, and he'd celebrated that night by taking Cassandra to the most expensive restaurant in the city, toasting his freedom while Isabella presumably wept alone in whatever homeless shelter would take her. But as Isabella continued her performance at his altar, her voice never wavering as she detailed financial crimes that could put him away for life, Marcus began to understand with creeping dread that every moment of his victory 3 years ago had been carefully orchestrated by a woman far more intelligent and dangerous than he'd ever given her credit for, because the stress-induced breakdown that had hospitalized her hadn't been real, it had been theater. A performance designed to make him believe he'd won while she quietly documented everything, photographed everything, recorded everything, building a case so airtight that even his team of corrupt lawyers wouldn't be able to poke holes in it. The beautiful thing about being declared mentally incompetent, Isabella was saying now, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned garden, is that people stop watching you quite so carefully. They assume you're harmless, broken, no longer a threat to their carefully constructed lies. Prince Alessandro squeezed her hand supportively, his dark eyes fixed on Marcus with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. My beloved Isabella spent 18 months in various treatment facilities, the prince continued, his accent lending gravity to every word, where she met some very interesting people, a former CIA analyst being treated for PTSD who taught her about offshore banking regulations, a disgraced FBI forensic accountant whose specialty was following money trails through shell companies, a Swiss banking investigator whose addiction treatment was being funded by a very generous anonymous donor who happened to need certain favors in return. The pieces clicked together in Marcus's mind like bullets loading into a chamber, each revelation more devastating than the last. Because Isabella hadn't been broken during those months of treatment. She'd been recruited, trained, turned into a weapon specifically designed to destroy him with surgical precision. But the real breakthrough came, Isabella continued, her smile now sharp enough to cut glass, when I met a certain Russian oligarch's daughter who was being treated for depression after her father's empire was seized by international authorities. She taught me something very valuable about how old European money works, how real power operates, how families like Alessandro's can open doors that American nouveau riche like you, Marcus, will never even know exist. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing as Isabella revealed the scope of her transformation, and Marcus felt reality shifting around him like quicksand because the woman standing before him wasn't just wealthy or connected. She'd been systematically destroying his life from the shadows for 3 years, placing herself in positions to access his most guarded secrets while he'd been smugly celebrating her supposed defeat. The art exhibitions in Paris and Milan weren't just cultural events, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she revealed each layer of her master plan. They were money laundering operations for my new associates, a way to move funds and favors while building my reputation in circles that consider American billionaires to be amusing playthings at best. And Alessandro's banking connections allowed us to trace every illegal dollar you've ever moved, every bribe you've ever paid, every life you've ever destroyed in pursuit of profit. She gestured toward the second envelope still clutched in Marcus's trembling hands. That contains documentation of your involvement in the assassination of 3 investigative journalists, records of your payments to war criminals, and video evidence of meetings you thought were private, including a particularly damning conversation from last month where you discussed eliminating a 4th journalist who was getting too close to your operations in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Marcus's knees gave out entirely as he sank into the chair that had been placed behind the altar for the elderly priest, his $50 million mansion suddenly feeling like a prison, his 300 powerful guests now witnesses to his complete destruction, and through the roaring in his ears he heard Isabella deliver the final blow. Oh, and Marcus? That art teacher you thought I was cheating with? David Rodriguez? He wasn't my lover. He was an undercover federal agent investigating your art theft and money laundering operations, and our affair was actually me feeding him information about your private collection of stolen Nazi artifacts hidden in your vault upstairs, the same vault whose combination you whispered to me on our wedding night because you trusted me completely. The revelation hit him like a physical blow because David Rodriguez, quiet, gentle David who taught watercolor painting at the community center where Isabella had volunteered, had been gathering evidence about the stolen Picassos and Monets that Marcus had acquired through murdered collectors in war zones, had been building a case while Marcus had convinced himself that his wife was just a lonely housewife seeking attention from a poor man's substitute for her billionaire husband. The darkness of that first winter after the divorce was so complete that Isabella had almost forgotten what sunlight felt like, living in a rat-infested studio apartment in East LA with nothing but a salvaged mattress on the floor and the clothes she'd been wearing the day Marcus had the locks changed, surviving on day-old bread from a sympathetic baker and the occasional $5 bill she earned cleaning offices at night for cash under the table, but it was during those endless hours of scrubbing other people's toilets and emptying their trash that Isabella's Harvard-trained mind had begun to work differently, not dwelling on her losses but cataloging every detail of her destruction, every lie Marcus had told, every manipulation he'd used, and she'd started keeping a journal written in code on napkins she stole from the buildings she cleaned, documenting not just her pain but her growing understanding of how thoroughly she'd been played. The breakthrough had come on a February night so cold that her breath fogged in her unheated apartment, when she'd been sorting through the few personal items Marcus had allowed her to keep, mostly worthless trinkets he'd considered beneath notice, and found something that made her blood freeze in her veins, a USB drive hidden inside the lining of her grandmother's antique jewelry box, a drive she'd completely forgotten about, but which contained every financial document, every suspicious email, Every piece of evidence she'd gathered during those final months of their marriage, when she begun to suspect that her husband's wealth came from sources far darker than real estate development. That drive had been her insurance policy, created in secret during those terrifying weeks when she'd realized that Marcus was capable of anything, and as she'd sat on her mattress with her dying laptop, scrolling through gigabytes of incriminating evidence, she'd finally understood the true scope of her ex-husband's crimes and realized that she wasn't just a victim. She was the only person on earth with the power to bring him down, if she could survive long enough and get smart enough and powerful enough to use what she knew. The first step had been finding David Rodriguez, not the gentle art teacher Marcus thought he was, but FBI agent David Rodriguez, working deep undercover to investigate international art theft rings. And when Isabella had approached him with her evidence and her story, his reaction had been immediate and electric. "Jesus Christ, Isabella, do you have any idea what you're sitting on? This isn't just tax evasion or money laundering. This is crimes against humanity. And you've got documentation that half the intelligence agencies in the world have been trying to find for a decade." David had introduced her to Agent Sarah Chun, a brilliant Chinese-American forensic accountant who specialized in untangling the financial webs of international criminals, and Sarah had taken one look at Isabella's evidence and made a phone call that would change everything. "I need to speak to someone very important," she'd said, her voice tight with excitement, because what this woman has could take down not just one billionaire, but an entire network of war profiteers, arms dealers, and environmental terrorists. And I think there are some very powerful people who would be extremely grateful for this kind of cooperation. The transformation that followed was so surreal that Isabella sometimes wondered if she was living in someone else's life, because within 6 months of that phone call she'd found herself in a private jet flying to Geneva, where she'd been introduced to a coalition of European banking families, environmental organizations, and human rights groups who'd been hunting Marcus Whitmore and his associates for years without success. And they'd offered her something that seemed too good to be true: complete protection, unlimited resources, and a new identity in exchange for her evidence and her willingness to serve as bait in the most elaborate sting operation in international law enforcement history. Prince Alessandro di Luca hadn't been random. He'd been assigned to her as both protector and cover story, his genuine banking expertise and diplomatic immunity providing the perfect shield while Isabella learned to move in the highest circles of European society. But what neither of them had expected was that their fake relationship would slowly, carefully, beautifully transform into something real. Something deeper than either had thought possible, and as Isabella had evolved from broken victim to international woman of mystery, Alessandro had found himself falling genuinely in love with her brilliant mind, her unexpected humor, her incredible resilience, and her absolute commitment to justice no matter the personal cost. The art exhibitions were perfect covers, Isabella continued, her voice now carrying clearly across the garden where Marcus's wedding guests sat transfixed by her revelation. Because art galleries are excellent places to meet very wealthy, very discreet people who might have information about stolen artifacts, illegal mining operations, or offshore banking irregularities. And my new European friends were quite generous about funding my artistic endeavors, while I gathered intelligence about your entire network of criminal associates. Marcus's hands were shaking so badly now that he dropped several pages of evidence, the documents scattering across the altar like autumn leaves, and as he scrambled to collect them, he caught fragments of conversations from his guests. "Is this real? My God, look at these photographs. Someone call the SEC immediately. I had no idea Whitmore was involved with." The whispers built to a roar as 300 of the world's most powerful people realized they were witnesses to the exposure of crimes that would dominate international headlines for years, and through it all Isabella stood like a statue of perfect composure, her emerald eyes reflecting not triumph but something far more dangerous, the cold satisfaction of a woman whose patience had been infinite and whose revenge was absolute. "But perhaps the most beautiful part of this entire operation," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper so that everyone had to strain to hear, "was discovering that you, Marcus, had been investigating me during our marriage, hiring private investigators to document my supposed infidelity, installing cameras in our home to catch me betraying you, monitoring my every move because you were convinced that anyone who got close to your secrets would eventually turn against you, which means that all of this evidence, every crime you committed, every murder you ordered, every life you destroyed, was captured by your own surveillance system, preserved in digital files that you thought were securing your safety but were actually documenting your guilt. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place as Isabella revealed the masterstroke of her revenge. Marcus had been so paranoid about being betrayed that he'd created a perfect record of his own crimes, and Isabella had simply waited for the right moment, the right allies, and the right opportunity to turn his own weapons against him, transforming his wedding day, the moment of his supposed ultimate triumph, into the stage for his complete and total annihilation. The scope of Isabella's revenge is mind-blowing. She's been playing a 3-year game that makes chess look like checkers. But how did a broken woman convince European banking dynasties and federal agents to help her? And what other secrets is she still hiding? Comment below with your theories, because this story is about to take another insane turn. The sound of sirens in the distance was barely audible over the chaos erupting in Marcus's garden, as his wedding guests began to realize they weren't just witnessing a dramatic confrontation, but potentially attending the live broadcast of a billionaire's arrest. Phones appearing everywhere as social media influencers among his carefully curated guest list began live-streaming what would become the most viral wedding disaster in history, but it was Cassandra's reaction that sent the first real spike of terror through Marcus's chest, because instead of rushing to his side or defending him or even looking shocked, his bride-to-be was backing away from the altar with her hands pressed to her mouth, her blue eyes wide with what looked less like surprise and more like recognition. "Cassandra," Marcus croaked, his voice barely audible as he watched his perfect fiancée continue retreating, her $200,000 wedding dress rustling like dying leaves. "What are you doing?" "Come here, we can figure this out, we can." But Cassandra was shaking her head, blonde curls bouncing with each violent movement, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tremor that Marcus had never heard before, a crack in the porcelain perfection that revealed something raw and desperate underneath. "I'm sorry, Marcus, I'm so sorry, but I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending that I don't know what you are, what you've done." Her words hit him like individual bullets, each syllable precise and devastating, and as she continued backing away from him, her designer heels slipping slightly on the marble steps, Marcus felt reality tilt further off its axis, because Cassandra knew, had always known, and her presence in his life hadn't been the fairy tale romance he believed, but something else entirely. Something orchestrated and planned and utterly calculated. Isabella's laugh was like silver wind chimes in a hurricane as she watched Marcus's second foundation crumble in real time, her emerald eyes sparkling with an emotion that went beyond satisfaction into something approaching divine justice. "Oh, my dear Marcus," she said, her voice carrying easily across the garden where 300 of the world's elites sat frozen like statues. "Surely you didn't think that Cassandra Vale, graduate of Juilliard, fluent in 4 languages, holder of advanced degrees in psychology and international finance, would fall in love with you by accident?" The implications of Isabella's words crashed over Marcus like a tsunami, because Cassandra wasn't just a supermodel, wasn't just a beautiful woman who'd been dazzled by his wealth and power. She was educated, sophisticated, intelligent enough to see through his carefully constructed facade, which meant that everything about their relationship, every moment of passion and tenderness and intimate connection, had been as fake as the financial statements he filed with the SEC. The sirens were getting louder now, and through the perfectly manicured hedges that surrounded his estate, Marcus could see the flashing lights of what looked like an entire convoy of law enforcement vehicles. But the approaching arrest was nothing compared to the horror of watching Cassandra transform before his eyes from devoted fiancée into something else entirely. Her tear-streaked face hardening into resolve as she reached into her bouquet and withdrew a small recording device that had been hidden among the white roses, her voice steady now as she addressed the crowd. "For the past 18 months, I've been gathering evidence about Marcus Whitmore's criminal activities under the direction of the International Criminal Court, and everything you've heard here today, every confession, every piece of evidence presented by Isabella, has been recorded and transmitted directly to law enforcement agencies in 12 countries. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly executed, that Marcus actually felt a twisted admiration for the scope of the conspiracy arrayed against him, because Cassandra hadn't just been playing a role, she'd been serving as both honey trap and recording device, documenting his private admissions about bribing politicians, ordering murders, and covering up environmental disasters, all while he'd believed he was seducing her with his power and wealth. "The night you told me about the cobalt mines," Cassandra continued, her voice growing stronger as federal agents in tactical gear began appearing at the edges of the garden like dark angels, when you laughed about how easy it was to buy warlords and dispose of inconvenient villages. I almost broke cover right then because I've seen the photographs of those mass graves, Marcus. I've interviewed the survivors, and listening to you brag about genocide while you poured champagne was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life." She was crying now, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of rage, of justice finally being served, of a year and a half of enforced intimacy with a monster finally coming to an end. And as she spoke, Marcus began to understand that every kiss they'd shared, every moment of apparent passion, every whispered endearment had been part of an investigation so thorough and so patient that it made his own destruction of Isabella look amateur by comparison. The federal agents were spreading through his estate now like a plague, their tactical gear and weapons creating a stark contrast to the white flowers and romantic lighting he'd spent months planning, and as they approached the altar with arrest warrants that would end his freedom forever, Marcus found himself looking not at the approaching officers but at Isabella, at the woman he'd tried to break who had instead broken him so completely that even his own wedding had become a weapon turned against him. Prince Alessandro stepped forward then, his diplomatic immunity allowing him a freedom that the federal agents couldn't touch, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of international law and old-world justice. "Mr. Whitmore, you are hereby informed that your assets in 17 countries have been frozen pending investigation into crimes against humanity, that your corporate empire is being dismantled by a coalition of international authorities, and that the evidence compiled by my fiancée and her associates will ensure that you spend the rest of your life answering for every drop of blood on your hands." But it was Isabella who delivered the final perfect blow, stepping close enough that only Marcus could hear her words, her voice soft as velvet and sharp as a blade. "3 years ago, you told me that I was worthless, that I would never amount to anything without you, that destroying me was as easy as crushing an ant, and you were right about one thing, Marcus. You did destroy the woman I used to be. But what you created in her place is something far more dangerous than you ever imagined, and this," she gestured toward the chaos consuming his wedding, toward the agents closing in, toward the life he'd spent decades building crashing down around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. "This is what happens when you underestimate the power of a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain." The desperation that flooded Marcus's system was like liquid fire, burning away 3 years of smug satisfaction and replacing it with the primal survival instincts that had built his empire in the first place. And as the federal agents closed in with their handcuffs gleaming like silver promises of imprisonment, he did what he'd always done when cornered. He attacked, spinning toward Isabella with the wild eyes of a man watching his world collapse in real time and snarling words that cut through the garden air like shattered glass. "You think you're so clever, Isabella, but you have no idea what you've just unleashed, because those mining operations, those weapons deals, those murdered journalists, they weren't my operations alone, they were part of something bigger, something that involves people who make me look like a choir boy, and when they find out that you've exposed their network, when they realize that your little revenge fantasy has compromised decades of carefully planned operations, they will hunt you down and eliminate you and everyone you've ever loved with a kind of efficiency that makes my crimes look like parking tickets." His words should have been empty threats, desperate bluffs from a man facing life imprisonment, but Isabella's face went pale, her confident mask slipping for the first time since she'd arrived, and Prince Alessandro immediately stepped closer to her, his hand moving instinctively toward what Marcus now realized was probably a concealed weapon, while federal agents began barking orders into their radios with increased urgency. Their casual arrest operation suddenly transformed into something that looked more like a military extraction. You see, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength as he watched fear creep into Isabella's eyes, the consortium doesn't forgive exposure, and they don't believe in witnesses, and every person in this garden right now, every senator, every tech mogul, every Hollywood elite who's seen these documents, just became a liability that needs to be eliminated. Which means your perfect revenge has just sentenced 300 innocent people to death, including your precious prince and whatever fantasy future you thought you were building. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the growing roar of helicopters overhead. Too many helicopters, Marcus noted with grim satisfaction, because the cavalry was arriving, and it wasn't coming to save him. Senator Patricia Blackwood was on her feet now, her face ashen as she processed the implications of Marcus's words. Her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in urgent whispers to someone whose response made her sink back into her chair like a woman receiving news of her own death, while tech billionaire David Chun had gone completely white. His usual composure cracked wide open as he stared at the documents scattered around the altar with the expression of a man realizing he'd stumbled into a war zone disguised as a garden party. The chaos that erupted next was like watching a carefully orchestrated ballet of terror, because the helicopters descending toward Marcus's estate weren't federal aircraft. They were unmarked black machines that federal agents immediately recognized as hostile. Their tactical team leader screaming into his radio for backup while simultaneously trying to evacuate the wedding guests who were now trapped in the crossfire of an international incident they'd never seen coming. Isabella. Prince Alessandro's voice cut through the mayhem with urgent authority, his diplomatic training kicking in as he wrapped his arms around his fiancée and began moving her toward the marble columns of the mansion's facade. We need to get you out of here immediately, because if Marcus is telling the truth about the consortium, then this entire operation was compromised from the beginning, and they've been waiting for exactly this moment to eliminate everyone who knows too much about their network. But Isabella wasn't moving, wasn't running, wasn't showing any of the terror that Marcus had expected, and instead her face was transforming again, this time into something that made his blood freeze because he recognized that expression. It was the same cold calculation he'd seen in his own mirror during his darkest moments. The look of someone who'd planned for every contingency and was 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. "Oh, Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly despite the roar of approaching aircraft and the shouts of federal agents trying to establish a perimeter. "You really haven't figured it out yet, have you? You still think this is about revenge, about justice, about exposing your crimes to the world. But this was never about punishment, my darling ex-husband. This was about recruitment." The words hit him like a physical blow, and as the first black helicopter touched down on his perfectly manicured lawn, disgorging men in military gear who moved with the precision of elite special forces, Marcus began to understand with creeping horror that Isabella's transformation hadn't been from victim to avenger. It had been from innocent wife to something far more dangerous. Something that made his own criminal empire look like a child's lemonade stand. "The consortium you're so afraid of," Isabella continued, her voice steady as gunfire erupted somewhere beyond the garden walls, "has been looking for new leadership, new blood, someone with the intelligence to modernize their operations and the ruthlessness to eliminate their current problems. And when they learned about a brilliant woman who'd been systematically destroyed by one of their most reckless associates, a woman with nothing to lose and everything to prove, they made her an offer she couldn't refuse." Prince Alessandro's smile was sharp as a blade as he added his own revelation to the growing pile of impossibilities. "The De Luca banking dynasty didn't just help Isabella investigate your crimes, Mr. Whitmore. We've been the consortium's financial arm for 3 generations, and Isabella's evidence against you wasn't gathered to destroy you. It was compiled to demonstrate her worthiness to replace you as the North American Operations Director, a position that comes with certain responsibilities you've proven yourself incapable of handling." Marcus felt his knees give out entirely as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered by his ex-wife, he'd been systematically replaced by her, his entire criminal empire absorbed into a larger organization that had been testing Isabella's capabilities for 3 years while using his own paranoia and cruelty as the perfect training ground for his successor. And as the black-clad soldiers surrounded him with weapons drawn, their leader addressing Isabella with respectful deference, Marcus realized that his wedding day had become not just his destruction but his ex-wife's coronation, her formal ascension to power that would make his own influence look like amateur hour, and the woman he'd tried to crush had not only survived but evolved into something that surpassed his darkest nightmares, because Isabella Moreau wasn't just seeking justice, she was claiming an empire. The gunfire that had been echoing from beyond the garden walls suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than the violence, and as Marcus knelt on the altar steps surrounded by scattered evidence of his crimes, he watched Isabella signal to the black-clad soldiers with hand gestures that spoke of military training he'd never known she possessed. Her movements precise and confident as she directed what was clearly her own private army rather than the hostile force he'd assumed was coming to eliminate witnesses. "You see, Marcus," Isabella's voice was conversational now, almost gentle, as she approached his crumpled form with the fluid grace of a predator circling wounded prey. The consortium's previous leadership had become sloppy, careless, too fond of unnecessary violence and public attention, which is why they needed someone with a subtler touch. Someone who understood that true power operates in shadows and silk rather than blood and brutality. The federal agents who had been preparing to arrest Marcus were now standing frozen as the black-clad soldiers, not mercenaries, Marcus realized with growing dread, but legitimate military personnel whose uniforms bore no identifying marks but whose bearings screamed elite special forces, formed a protective perimeter around the garden, their weapons trained outward rather than inward, protecting the wedding guests rather than threatening them. Prince Alessandro stepped forward then, his diplomatic demeanor shifting into something harder, more authoritative, as he addressed the stunned crowd with the voice of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of world leaders. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the dramatic nature of today's events, but I'm afraid Mr. Whitmore's activities have posed a significant threat to international security, and his elimination from the consortium's operations has been deemed necessary for the safety of all involved." Marcus's mind reeled as he processed the word elimination, but Alessandro continued with chilling calm. "However, I want to assure you that none of you are in any danger. Quite the opposite, in fact, because Isabella's ascension to leadership represents a new era of stability and prosperity for everyone in this network, and your presence here today serves as witnesses to a transition of power that will benefit us all." The guests, senators, tech moguls, entertainment industry titans, foreign ambassadors, began exchanging glances that spoke of understanding, of connections and agreements that had been hidden beneath the surface of polite society, and Marcus realized with dawning horror that his wedding hadn't been infiltrated by Isabella's allies. His guest list had been composed of consortium members from the beginning, people who'd been waiting for this moment, this transition, this coronation disguised as a wedding disaster. The second wave of revelations hit Marcus like a tsunami when Isabella knelt beside him on the altar steps, her designer dress pooling around her like spilled midnight, and placed a gentle hand on his cheek with the tenderness of a wife comforting her husband, except her emerald eyes held no warmth, only the cold efficiency of someone delivering a death sentence with exquisite politeness. "The truth is, darling," she whispered, her voice pitched so low that only Marcus could hear while the garden buzzed with activity as consortium members began networking and making deals as if his destruction was just an interesting sideshow to the main event. "I never stopped loving you, not even when you destroyed me, not even when you left me broken and bleeding in that gutter you called a divorce. Because love and hate are just different faces of the same obsession, and spending 3 years planning your downfall taught me something beautiful and terrible, that I'm exactly like you, Marcus, maybe even worse than you, because at least your cruelty was honest while mine has been wrapped in justice and righteousness and the pretense of moral superiority." Her fingers traced along his jawline with mock affection as she continued, "Every crime you committed, I've committed 10 more in service of bringing you down. Every life you destroyed, I've destroyed dozens more while building the network that would replace you, every moral line you crossed, I've obliterated entirely while convincing myself that it was all in service of some higher purpose. But the truth is that I became everything I once hated about you, and the only difference between us now is that I'm better at it, smarter at it, and infinitely more dangerous because people trust broken women seeking justice while they fear men seeking profit. The horror of her words sank into Marcus's chest like acid because he was beginning to understand that Isabella's transformation hadn't been from victim to hero, it had been from innocent to monster, and every moment of her suffering had been carefully cultivated not to create sympathy, but to forge a weapon of such perfect psychological complexity that even the consortium's ancient leadership had been impressed enough to hand her an empire. But here's the beautiful part, Isabella continued, her lips so close to his ear that her breath sent shivers down his spine. I'm going to let you live, Marcus, not out of mercy but because death would be too simple, too clean, too final for what you deserve. Instead, you're going to spend the rest of your days in a federal supermax prison watching me on the news as I run your empire better than you ever could, as I make deals you never dreamed of, as I become everything you wanted to be but lacked the vision and intelligence to achieve. And every night when you're lying on your concrete bunk, you'll remember that you created me, shaped me, forged me into the perfect replacement for your own inadequacy. The federal agents were approaching now, but slowly, respectfully, like servants awaiting permission from their true master, and Marcus realized that even law enforcement was part of Isabella's web, that his arrest would be as choreographed as everything else, designed not just to remove him from power but to legitimize Isabella's ascension in the eyes of both criminal and legitimate authorities. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists with the finality of a coffin lid closing, Marcus looked up one last time at the woman who had been his wife, his victim, and ultimately his destroyer, and saw in her emerald eyes not the broken girl he'd married or the vengeful ex-wife he'd expected, but something new and terrible and absolutely magnificent. The birth of a queen whose reign would make his own empire look like a sandbox kingdom, whose power would span continents and whose influence would reshape the criminal underworld in ways that even the consortium's founders had never imagined. And the last thing he heard as they dragged him away from the ruins of his wedding was Isabella's voice, clear as crystal and cold as winter stars, addressing her new subjects with the authority of someone born to rule. Ladies and gentlemen, the coronation is complete. The transition is official, and I believe it's time we discuss the future of our organization, a future that will be far more profitable, far more sophisticated, and infinitely more successful than anything we've achieved under previous management. Isabella isn't just getting revenge, she's taking over an international criminal empire. But what does this mean for all the wedding guests who just witnessed this power transfer? And is this really the end for Marcus, or does he have one final card to play? The climax is here, and nothing will ever be the same. The final twist came not in the form of violence or betrayal but in something far more devastating. Truth, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's blade as Isabella stood among the ruins of Marcus's wedding, her emerald eyes sweeping across the 300 witnesses who had just watched her claim an empire, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before, a crack in the perfect facade that revealed something raw and vulnerable underneath all the calculated revenge and political maneuvering. But there's one more thing you all need to know, she said, her hand finding Prince Alessandro's with a desperation that belied her composed exterior, something that changes everything about this story, about my transformation, about the real reason I spent 3 years building the power to destroy the man I once loved more than life itself. The garden was so silent that even the distant sirens seemed muted, and Marcus, despite the handcuffs cutting into his wrists and the federal agents flanking him like stone guardians, found himself leaning forward because Isabella's tone had shifted into something he'd never heard before. Not the broken victim of their marriage's end, not the cold mastermind who'd orchestrated his downfall, but something infinitely more complex and heartbreaking. I was pregnant, the words fell from her lips like autumn leaves, each syllable weighted with years of buried pain, and Marcus felt the world stop spinning entirely because this was impossible. This changed everything. This meant that when he'd thrown her out, when he destroyed her mentally and financially and emotionally, When he'd systematically dismantled her entire existence, she'd been carrying his child, their child. The family they'd talked about during those rare tender moments when his armor had slipped and he'd allowed himself to dream of something beyond power and profit. 12 weeks along when you had me committed to that psychiatric facility, Isabella continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, washing away 3 years of carefully constructed composure, and the stress, the medications they forced on me, the malnutrition from being unable to afford proper food after you froze our accounts. I lost our baby in that sterile hospital room while you were celebrating your legal victory with champagne and your new girlfriend. Prince Alessandro's arm tightened around her shoulders as she spoke, his face a mask of controlled fury that suggested he was imagining very specific forms of revenge against the man who had caused his beloved this unimaginable pain, while Cassandra stood frozen at the edge of the altar, her recording device forgotten in her hands as she processed the magnitude of trauma she'd helped expose, the understanding that her undercover operation had revealed not just financial crimes but a personal tragedy of devastating proportions. The revelation shattered something fundamental in the garden's atmosphere, transforming Isabella's calculated revenge into something far more primal and heartbreaking, because Marcus was remembering now, the morning sickness Isabella had attributed to stress, the way she'd been protecting her stomach during their final fight, the doctor's appointment she'd mentioned the day before he'd had her committed. Details he dismissed as unimportant in his rush to destroy her before she could destroy him, and now those memories were assembling into a picture so horrific that even his blackened soul recoiled from the implications. "So yes," Isabella said, her voice stronger now, steel reinforced with righteous fury, "I became everything you feared I would become. I claimed power you never dreamed possible. I built an empire on the ashes of my grief. And I turned your own weapons against you with a precision that would have made you proud if you were capable of pride in anyone other than yourself. But every step of this journey, every crime I committed, every life I destroyed, every moral line I crossed was in service of one simple goal, making sure that you understand exactly what you took from me when you chose power over love, money over family, empire over the chance to hold your own child in your arms." The black helicopters were landing now, their rotors whipping Isabella's hair around her face like a dark halo, and from their open doors stepped figures that made even the federal agent step back in recognition. International police, diplomatic security, representatives of governments whose power stretched across continents, all coming to escort Isabella to her new role as head of an organization that operated beyond the reach of any single nation's laws. Prince Alessandro kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness before stepping back to allow the new arrivals to approach, his face reflecting the complex mix of love and loss that comes with understanding that the woman you adore is also capable of reshaping the criminal underworld with her bare hands. And as Isabella turned one final time to look at Marcus, her expression held not triumph but something infinitely sadder. The grief of a woman who had gained everything she'd wanted except the one thing that had mattered most. "Our child would have been 3 years old today," she whispered, the words carrying across the distance between them like a final blessing or curse. "And every day for the rest of your life, I want you to remember that your greed, your paranoia, your inability to trust the only person who ever truly loved you, cost us both the chance to be the family we might have been." The federal agents began leading Marcus away as Isabella walked toward her waiting helicopter, her transformation complete but her victory hollow, leaving behind a garden full of witnesses to a story that would reshape international criminal law, topple governments, and create legends that would be whispered in the highest circles of power for decades to come. But at its heart remained the tragedy of two people who had loved each other enough to create life together, but had destroyed each other so completely that only one could survive, and the survivor would spend the rest of her days ruling an empire built on the grave of everything she had once held sacred. What started as a wedding crasher's revenge became the coronation of a criminal empress, but at what cost? Isabella gained the world but lost her soul, her child, and any chance of the simple happiness she'd once shared with Marcus. Was her victory worth the price? Share your thoughts below, because this ending will haunt you long after the story ends.